What is up, everyone? This is the Patreon podcast, episode number 6, I think. Um, I'll have to double check that. But today we're covering the F1 race from Sunday, um, round 2 of the season, and then going over our Sweet 16 predictions, storylines, everything in between. And joining me from Austin, Texas, the Stat King himself, Mr. Michael Wayne. What's up?
What's up, everybody? Welcome into our
That
sixth, I
King.
guess. Can you hear me?
Hold on. Something's not right.
Can you hear me? No.
Sorry, try now.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that, guys. Welcome in to our fifth or sixth, whatever it may be, Patreon podcast. If you haven't already, check out our other Patreon podcasts. Our last one that we also talked about F1. We had a really fun segment that we did where I am a novice to F1 still. Emmy quizzed me on the terminology, the slang, F1 slang. And I actually did a lot better than I thought I would do. Go check that out. Check out our social media pages, including our TikTok. We'll be posting more on that. And then also check out the episodes we recorded last week into last weekend for our first and second round March Madness reactions, plus some NFL free agency and NBA stuff. And we're bringing you content weekly, 1 or 2 episodes a week at the very least. So like and subscribe and spread the word to your friends. But let's waste no time and let's just get into the content, starting with the Saudi Grand Prix, which happened this weekend. Sergio Perez, also known as, is it Checo?
Yeah, check out.
Do you know is that just his nickname or?
Yeah, that's just a nickname he's always had. I'm not entirely sure on the origin of it, but um I've only been a fan of F1 for a couple of years now, so I would have to do my research on it.
Okay. So Sergio Perez actually edged out his teammate Max Verstappen for the win. Um, I'll just start with you since you are the more well versed in the F1 space. What were your main takeaways from the race, your surprises and disappointments, your winners and losers?
Well, I think the main thing you have to take away is the Red Bulls are just miles ahead of every other team on the grid right now. I mean, you look at straight line speed, cornering speed, everything. I mean, tire wear. I mean, everything. There's like no facet of the race where any other team can even touch them, and that's unprecedented, especially with all of the measures the FIA has taken to um, level the playing field, including um, implementing a cost cap and uh, staggering the amount of um, aero testing each team can do. The best teams get less times than the worst teams, and with Red Bull, having the penalties they got from breaching the cost cap last year, they have even less aero testing time than what they would have had, and they're still just getting so much more out of the car. Um, so I mean, like a lot of people are, um, down about F1, kind of bored with what's going on. But I mean, you just got to take what it is and just, I mean, it's incredible stuff, honestly.
Yeah, I'm newer to F1. I'll just let everyone know that again. Red Bull has obviously been dominant. They finished 1-2 in both races to this point, the Bahrain and the Saudi. But the thing that stood out to me is Aston Martin. They really, to this point, have been the second quickest team for race pace. Fernando Alonso taking the early lead, eventually losing it to Checo on lap 4. But Aston Martin has been really impressive so far this season, even with, I believe it was Alonso's 5-second time penalty. He was able to keep Mercedes back. And actually, his teammate, Lance Stroll, uh, would have likely been in the mix too if it weren't for a power issue forcing him to retire early on in the race. So that's really something that stood out to me. I'm not well versed in the history of F1 and what's happened in the past and what sort of the precedent for each team that has been set in the past and how it compares to now. But I think Aston Martin in both races so far, but particularly in this race with Alonso continuing his early season good performance, has been something that stood out to the newcomer fan of F1.
Yeah, and the one thing I'll say about Aston Martin is they've had a quick rise to the front of the grid. And it was really the big shift was when um, they were formerly they were Team Force India, owned by a uh, billionaire from India, and then he got into trouble with the law, and then he had to give off the team, and then in comes Lawrence Stroll, whose son Lance Stroll was already in Formula One, um, buys the team, and then rebrands it to Aston Martin, and the big, marketing or whatever you want to call it that they put out to the public was we're going to have a 5-year plan to get to the front and compete for titles. And at this point, it's only been 3 years since they've changed over to Aston Martin, and to be at this point where they're the second fastest car on the grid and the second best in racecraft and everything and and reliability as well, it's really impressive.
Absolutely. Now, when we look at the other side of the spectrum, and again, I don't know the president, but Ferrari, they're having some issues. Now, they could probably explain sort of what happened in Bahrain, because from what I know, which is very little, there's sort of like an outlier nature to that circuit based on what I've been reading, in that, particularly when it comes to tire, what do you
Tire
call
wear.
it? Yeah, tire wear, exactly. But this track in Jeddah, um, from what I have read and researched, was a track that was supposed to fit the Ferrari car, and that it's a track that suits it because it's a track with low tire wear. And Charles Leclerc, uh, in his Thursday press conference, if that's or media availability, spoke to how he thought he could do something pretty special. Um, but I think there's been some reliability issues with their car in particular. I don't know if you can speak to that more, but it just seems like they're not where they'd like to be right now. Is that an accurate statement?
Definitely. Ferrari last year was in the championship fight last year in terms of having the car that was, that had the pace aligning with Red Bull. But every other facet was what went wrong for Ferrari last year. Um, when it comes to strategy, pitting at the correct time, getting onto the correct tires, or just having long pit stops, or the engine exploding, or just driver error, just having crashes. Um, Everything that could have gone wrong went wrong last year. So coming into this year, um, from a Ferrari fan perspective, it was thought to be um, they had a new team principal come in to try and kind of shore up the um, race strategy and management side of things. So it was thought to be just a reset, and now they can really compete. But the start of the year has just been extremely disappointing, and the whispers coming out of Ferrari right now is that they had to lower the the engine mode, like the engine power, because they were worried about the reliability of the engine. That wasn't reported officially, but that's kind of the rumor that's been around the F1 paddock. So um, Ferrari is definitely not where they want to be, and right now, I would guess their drivers are really ticked off with where they're at, and I could even see Charles Leclerc wanting out of that contract possibly. But that's another conversation for another day.
Man, this the whole like circus is just so
Yeah.
um entertaining. And as I get deeper into it, the more I read about it and the more you tell me about it, it's like great podcast fodder, I think. So that
Yeah.
will be fun. Now let's talk about obviously Red Bull, and I'll start with you again on this. Can Checo challenge Max throughout the long haul of this F1 season, in your opinion?
Well, historically, Checo hasn't been on par with Max in terms of pace. Especially, when they're 1-2 on the grid, it seems to be most of the time Max gets out in front, pushes onward, and gets like a 5 to 10 second lead. But something about street races really suits Checo's style of driving. Um, so I think there's definitely something to be said about, Checo's ability to manage his tires on, I think, a little bit better than Max. I think Max at certain points in the race, um, I wouldn't say it's a terrible thing, but he gets a little bit over eager in terms of wanting to push the limit and try to extract all the pace out of the car. When really, in reality, in the race, you want to have the ability to still have solid pace, but be able to maximize the tire's life. Like you want your tires to last as long as possible. Without wearing down. And Checo is really good at that. So I think at tracks like this one, that's a street race. Like I said, he's really good at street races, and also tracks that um, have really high tire degradation. I think could really suit Checo. But even with all that being said, it would be it's uphill battle. I mean, Max is such an amazing driver, and it's really unprecedented for him to have just for him to be so young and have this much experience in F1. I think he's in his 8th season in F1 and he's only 23 years old. He entered the sport at 16 years old as a
Wow.
prodigy, and he changed the sport forever. There had never been anything like that in Formula One, and now you're seeing teams go younger and younger and younger, and Max is the reason for that. And now he's basically a veteran and he's in his prime, which is just so scary.
And did I read that he already has 97 podiums in his career?
Yep. Already.
I mean, that at the age of 23, and how long do you think he's going to do this for? Like, I mean,
I think um barring, anything tragic happening, most drivers can get to the age of 40 or so. And with Fernando Alonso, he's 42, 43 years old. So who knows how long he could go with where, being able to keep up with your body and all that stuff is going to be 17 years down the line. So there's no telling.
yeah, the thing that stood out to me with Verstappen is he had the issue in qualifying,
Hmm.
which set his is it pole position back? I'm not exactly clear on the your starting point,
Yeah,
um,
his grid slot. Yeah,
his
he
grid slot.
he
Um,
started back in 15th place.
yeah, exactly, and he was still able to, despite some other issues, finish second, just I believe like 5 or 6 seconds off of Checo. Now, the encouraging sign for Checo in my eyes is that, Verstappen put some pressure on him in the later stages of this race, and he was able to fend him off. He seemed pretty unperturbed by the presence of Max Verstappen, and he had his advantage wiped away by the safety car, and he was still able to win this race. And you spoke to his success on street races like this one. How many more of those are there throughout the season? Do you know exactly?
Well, I don't have the number on the top of my head, but um, Australia is technically a street circuit. That's where we're going to next. It's kind of a hybrid circuit, I'd say. There's some parts that are just like Jeddah, where the walls are really close, but there's also parts where things like the entire track opens up. So it's kind of a hybrid track, but I would count it. And then you have tracks like Baku, which is literally on a public street that they set up for the Formula One cars, which is absolutely insane to me. And then Monaco, uh, the most historic race of the year. Singapore, I'd say out of the 23 races, my guess is there's about 8 or 9 street races, just from the top of my head. But I'll look it up right now while you're talking.
Okay, because I really want to know like how it actually compares. But while you do that, let's hit on a couple more things. And the thing that really stood out to me when we were talking about what we were going to talk about on this podcast, because that is a large part of what we do off the air. Um, this whole conversation around Mercedes and Lewis Hamilton is really interesting to me, and I want to get your thoughts on it, and I'll sort of give my perspective.
First things first, I'll say is um, I'm a big Mercedes fan. I'm a big Lewis Hamilton fan. Um, my entire family is really. Um, so the last year or so has been really tough for the Lewis Hamilton community and Mercedes community in general. And this week was no different. Qualifying in particular was really rough. He really struggled to really connect with the car. And to put that kind of in perspective, I'd kind of compare it to like um, there's just like a certain zone you get into in the car. Um, when you're in control and you feel like the car is kind of an extension of your body. Um, Lewis wasn't able to get to that point. It's more of like a mental state where you're just in a flow, I'd say. You could see it in other sports as well, but um, Formula One is, I guess, unique in that way with it being in cars and everything. But um, Lewis, he wasn't in tune with the car. He was really dejected after that qualifying session. In the interviews, he was given like one word answers, which is just really, um, it's really rare for him. It never happens really. He's known as being a very positive person. So seeing him that dejected really puts things in perspective with where Mercedes is really at. On the other side of things, though, George was getting a lot out of that car. He was able to get that car onto the second row on the grid, got it into fourth place, and then with the grid penalty for Charles Leclerc into third. So that is also really concerning for Lewis Hamilton. The fact that George was that much ahead in the same exact car.
Yeah, George was, I think, one of the underrated winners of this race. He was able to
Right.
really keep up with Alonso. But the Lewis conversation is interesting because you hit on something that I wanted to hit on. Is that his mood noticeably shifted between the post qualifying, where he really struggled, and the post race, because I think, as he said, you know, he actually thought that during the race, over the race distance, he found the car to be much more controllable and more
Mhm.
predictable.
Right.
Now, he also said that Mercedes is a long way off, which, I really don't want to speak on something I don't really know, but that seems to be the case. But I think it is encouraging for Mercedes as a whole that you saw Russell do that, but it's also concerning for Hamilton. Um, but at least for now, they seem to be in the mix with Aston Martin and Ferrari, at least for parts of these races. And hopefully they can get some positive momentum moving forward. But I think it's really interesting because he has won what 104, I believe, times in his
Mhm.
career, and people are wondering whether or not um, he's going to win again. Is that accurate? I mean,
Yeah, it's been a while. I mean, last year was the first season in his entire career in Formula One. So since 2007, he's never had a season where he didn't get a race win until last year. So
wow,
um, it's a bit of a drought right now, and I would attribute most of that to the car. But he also did have his chances last year. Over the second half of of last season, he was in the fight. I would say the car wasn't on par with quite on par with Red Bull, but he was in the fight to win races.
hmm. It's so interesting. Is there anything else that we should hit on before we move on? Because I don't want
Um,
to leave any stone unturned. We're going to be doing these Patreon podcasts with F1 content probably every couple weeks. The races only happen every other week, so there's only so
right,
much we can
and
talk
then
about in between. Anything else that
right.
we need to really hit on before we move on?
Um, the last thing I'll say is, on my other F1 podcast, Famigos F1, go check that out. By the way, it's on Spotify. Um, I had said basically we're looking at possibly a three-way fight for second in the constructors, and that would be between Aston, Ferrari, and Mercedes. And I think the thing that Mercedes has on its side in terms of the constructors championship is they're very consistent and they're not having the reliability issues that Aston and Ferrari have been having. So if Mercedes is consistently, around the top 5 with both drivers in every single race, in theory, with what we've seen so far from Aston and Ferrari with their inconsistencies, they'll be right there um, to get second place in the constructors, even though they're probably the fourth fastest car.
Interesting. Very interesting. Um,
Right.
so yeah, I mean,
It'll be interesting to follow that race for sure.
absolutely. And for the people who might not know, just real quickly explain what the constructors race is.
Okay. So the drivers' championship, as you know, is just the points the drivers get. But the constructors is um, each team has two drivers, and the constructors race is um, both of your team's drivers' points combined.
Okay.
So that's why I said with Mercedes, the fact that they're consistent is going to really help them in the constructor side of things, because it's both drivers. Both drivers have to be scoring points in order for you to win a constructor's title.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so now that we're clear on that, um, I mean, look, I've really enjoyed the first two races of the year. I'm really starting to get into it, starting to learn a lot more. And so I think as we go on throughout the F1 season, which goes until, is it November? Um,
Yeah, yeah, it goes until really late.
so it is quite the long haul here, but I
Right.
will continue to get better and gain more perspective from Emmy himself, going to listen to his podcast, which I haven't done yet, but I will be doing. So make sure you check that out and listening to other F1 podcasts as well. So I think
Right.
this will continue to be a good segment that we'll keep doing consistently on our Patreon channel. And hey, if you think that this is worthy of being on our actual, um, episodes, then let us know because we are definitely
Right.
willing to do that as well. But I guess with all that, 25-ish minutes in, we can move on if you're okay with that.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that covers everything.
So on episode, I believe it was 157 that we recorded. Damn, I'm forgetting. I think it was Saturday night because we did two podcasts on Saturday. And, we were doing our round two reactions. Or maybe it was Sunday. I can't remember. But I wanted to give you an opportunity since you kind of got cut off from the end of that episode for technical reasons, um, an opportunity to react to the rest of the second round. So wherever you want to go, before we get to the Sweet 16, if you have any remaining thoughts that you wanted to get off your chest from whether it be Saturday's games or Sunday's games, just wherever you want to take us, and we can start there.
Um,
And if not, that's okay.
well,
We'll just jump right into Sweet 16 discussion.
off the top of my head, um, well, I think we discussed Texas at length, obviously. That was the big thing for me. Um, but other than that, I don't really have much to say. So I think we should just jump into the
Okay.
Sweet 16 stuff because that can be covered as we're talking about the teams, I
Right,
think.
exactly. Okay. So my plan was just to go region by region, talk about these are regionals now. Four teams left in each region. It's the Sweet 16. There's 8 games, four tomorrow and four on Friday night. Let's start in the South, like we did, like we always have. You have Alabama and San Diego State. And then you have what's the other matchup in that region? I believe it's
Creighton and Princeton.
Creighton and Princeton. So thinking about those matchups, uh, here I'll start first. You started with all the F1 stuff. I think that my main thing in this region is that I would still favor Alabama, even with a less than 100% Brandon Miller, to come out of this region. However, I will say that I do think, and I said this at the end of our last episode, that San Diego State's size and athleticism, I think, can really, and their ability to slow the pace and really play physical basketball like they did, against a Furman team that was really just grinded down by that game against Virginia. I mean, they had really had no gas left in the tank. I think that speaks to how hard it can be sometimes to beat Virginia, although they have been vulnerable to losing early in the tournament. To beat that team, you have to, you know, it can be really hard. You got to sometimes beat the buzzer on a miracle play and force Kihei Clark into a very, very, very confusing and at the time stupid turnover. Um, so I think Furman was, worn down by that game, and that showed. But San Diego State, they are not afraid to get up underneath you, play physical, slow the pace. Uh, you know, they do struggle a little bit to score in the half court, and that's where I think Alabama will separate themselves in this game, and just the depth as well. But I do think for a while it's going to be a closer game than people think because their size and physicality, I think, could wear on Alabama, especially if they start to force turnovers and get out in transition. Because once they start doing that, um, it'll be interesting to see whether or not those guards for Alabama, Javon Quinterly, uh, and so forth, maybe get a little rattled. And as the pressure ramps up throughout the game, you never know what can happen. So I think
Right.
just that's the thing that stands out to me. I think overall, San Diego State is going to give Alabama a better game than people think. I do think Alabama is still the best team, even without a 100% healthy Brandon Miller. They have Noah Clowney and Betty Yako on the interior. Uh, Brandon Miller is by far the best player left in this tournament. And then Javon Quinterly and the amount of shooting that they have and the veteranness of a coach like Nate Oates still makes them the favorite. Being deep at all five positions, having two guys, they go 10 deep on this roster. That's really what's going to separate themselves from the rest of the field, in my opinion. But I do think San Diego State will give them some trouble, especially early on in this game.
Yeah, definitely. I think the main thing I see with San Diego State is their point of attack defense is some of the best in this entire tournament, and it's not just um, their lateral quickness or just like athletic ability. That certainly helps, but it's also a certain tenacity about them that's really telling. You can see it through the screen just how intense those guards are um, defensively, and it shows in their results as well over their last 5 games, including their Mountain West tournament. The most points they've given up is 61, and I mean that's really really good in college basketball. I mean, a good defensive showing is normally 65 to 70, somewhere in that range. So having a 5 game stretch where the most you're giving up is 61, I mean that's just elite level defense. So regardless, I think that's what's going to give San Diego State a chance in this game. I think, I agree with you in the fact that probably first half and maybe halfway through the second half, I think this could be a, 5 point game or lower. I think this could be really tight. But I think at some point in the second half, Alabama will start hitting shots, um, probably tough shots as well. And I think that shot making is going to be what separates them. I agree with you entirely, pretty much.
So I think the matchup I want to see in the Elite Eight is no hard feelings or offense to Princeton, but the matchup everyone wants to see out of this region in the regional final is Alabama and Creighton. I think Creighton, when they play at their best, with Kalkbrenner on the interior, I've spoken about this so many times, so I don't want to regurgitate information that I've already said before, but he just can do a little bit of everything. And I think he could give Alabama some issues. 7-1, can step out and shoot it a little bit. Is the Big East Defensive Player of the Year. Really good rim protector. Can match up with a Noah Clowney or um, a Betty Yako on the interior. And even when the Brandon Miller, he can step out and guard a little bit in the pick and rolls, and he's a switchable big. So I do think that with Arthur Kaluma, who has at least the athleticism, I don't know about the size, but the athleticism to match up with Brandon Miller on the wing. And with a veteran point guard in Ryan Nimhard, whose big brother obviously was very successful at Gonzaga, and Andrew Nimhard, I think with, this Creighton team, the pace that they like to play at, get out and run, I do worry about their depth a little bit, as I've said before, but I think they could really challenge Alabama. I don't know, on their best day, they could probably beat Alabama if Alabama's a bit off. But I do think that is the matchup we all want to see, just because it would be so fascinating, the variety of matchups that could potentially take place within that game, with Kaluma being one-on-one against Brandon Miller, and then Kalkbrenner and the variety of things that he presents, but particularly his matchup with Bediako and Noah Clowney. Clowney is smaller forward who can also step out and shoot it a little bit and put the ball on the floor and take it to the basket. So I think that the Creighton-Bama matchup is what we're heading towards. But if you're Creighton, you don't want to necessarily underestimate how good this Princeton team is. I think they're a really good basketball team. They're smart. They don't turn the ball over. They're not going to make mistakes. And they're really not intimidated by bigs, even though they don't see a lot of bigs the size of Kalkbrenner in the Ivy League and throughout conference play. They didn't seem intimidated by Arizona's bigs in the last, in the first round. And so I think that, I don't know, just don't underestimate Princeton, but I do think Creighton has the frontline talent to match up with Alabama.
Right. The thing that stood out to me with Princeton was their ability of their guards to get into the paint, to get 2 feet in the lane. I mention it a lot with teams like the Celtics in the NBA, but oftentimes you get 2 feet in the lane, everything opens up from there because you can have the defense in constant rotation. If Creighton can just cut off that penetration, I think that's going to be where things will become a lot more tough for Princeton. And it's not going to be that easy. Some of those guys are very slippery on that Princeton backcourt. So I'm not going to, rule out Princeton keeping it very tight for that entire game. And, once you get it to, that last 5 minutes, anything can happen. We know that. I mean, it's March Madness, but it's also the fact that we've mentioned over and over the course of covering this tournament is the fact that when a high seed is, in a tight game with a lower seed late in the second half, that's when, the players start to get a little bit tight and the pressure really starts to mount. And, at that point, everything just becomes unpredictable. So if you're Princeton, you just try to keep it close and then see what happens. I think it seems obvious to say, but that's your best bet.
Okay, so I think we hit on everything there. We're both still picking Bama, though, to come out of the
Yes.
South, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, let's move down to the East. Now, the East Regional, I believe, will be played at Madison Square Garden. So that is these two Sweet 16 games, Tennessee and FAU, and then Michigan State and Kansas State. The South Regional that we just spoke about will be played in Louisville, I believe. The East Regional will be Madison Square Garden. The Midwest will be Kansas City. And then the West, which I think is the most fascinating regional, with Gonzaga and UCLA, and then obviously Arkansas and UConn, that will be played in Las Vegas. So let's talk about the East real fast. Tennessee and FAU, it's as simple to me as FAU's ability to match Tennessee's excruciating physicality and just ability to beat you up and wear you down over the course of 40 minutes. FAU is a team that likes to get out and run, and they have some real athletes, but they don't really have the size nor the strength, I don't think, to compete with Tennessee. This is going to be a lower scoring game, and that obviously favors Tennessee. And the thing that I'll say about Tennessee is I think a lot of the general public was doubting Tennessee coming into the tournament just because, number one, they had one of the hottest teams in the country in their region, and that was Duke, or in their draw. And secondly, Tennessee is not 100% healthy right now. I mean, not only did they lose their point guard, Zakai Ziegler, for the season right before the SEC tournament, but they've had some other guys banged up. And just like some other teams left, they've struggled as well to, at sometimes, generate offense in the half court. But I think with Josiah Jordan James and the other guys that they have on this team, FAU is going to have to keep Tennessee off the offensive glass. And with their lack of size, I just don't see that happening. Tennessee has been very good at, generating offensive rebounds and second chance points. And when you give guys like Santiago Vescovi and Josiah Jordan James second chances, that's where you really get yourself into trouble. And that's where they really wear you down, making you defend for extra possessions. So I think we've just been reminded that even with a less than 100% healthy team, Rick Barnes is still a fantastic coach and can still get it done in the tournament, despite in the past couple of years having these sorts of talented teams that are in the top 20 throughout the season, but bail out early in the NCAA tournament. I think Rick Barnes is still one of the best that we have in college basketball, and that showed against Duke. I mean, right from the get-go, Duke was a physical, really good defensive team. But at the end of the day, it was Tennessee's veterans beating up on Duke's freshmen the entire game from start to finish. And so I just don't think that FAU has the size and strength to physically withstand the excruciating physicality of Tennessee throughout 40 minutes of this game. If they want to win, though, or give themselves a chance, it's going to have to be a track meet, like scoring up and down, going back and forth. And so that's my real take. I do think Tennessee gets past this. And look, if they play the way that they want to play, they're going to be hard to beat because not a whole lot of teams are going to be able to match that physicality that they bring over the course of 40 minutes. And so that's not really the more like entertaining game of this region. It's K-State, Michigan State. But I do think Tennessee is a team that I think a lot of people disrespected coming in, but they are really, really good. They're going to play like they want to play. And if you don't match their physicality, you're really in for a long day and likely a loss.
Yeah, I think I in particular really underrated Tennessee. Based on, Ken Pong rankings and, you know, everything that those numbers tell us, they should have been, right up near the top in terms of teams people predicted to make the Final Four. Yet a lot of people just wrote them off. Um, what they do defensively, you can't underrate that. I mean, that's what makes them so hard to beat. If you're, defending at that high of a level and your offense is just somewhat competent, and not to mention that offense is more than competent. Um they bring a lot of versatility to the table. They play with pace. They move the ball. I mean, that Tennessee team is going to be a tough out for anyone. And I think with the way the draw worked out, they're in a really good position to gain some momentum to get to the Final Four. I mean, it won't be an easy test. I'm not gonna say it's just um, a formality. It's definitely not. But one thing I will say is FAU won't have the physical matchup advantage that they've had in their other matchups.
Right. So let's talk about real fast. Let's address K-State and Michigan State. Um, just like your 1 or 2 minute thoughts on the game and who you think will eventually, in my opinion, meet Tennessee in the regional final and who you have coming out of the region.
Well, I'll start with this. Kansas State is by far the number one most entertaining watch of this entire tournament, in my opinion. Um, Keontae Johnson and their other guy, help me out here,
Marquise Noel. Yes.
Marquise Noel. They are, I mean, they're so dynamic and just the way they play just pops off the screen. I mean, it's just a unique dynamic duo in college basketball. It kind of almost gives the vibe of watching an NBA game, the way they work together as a dynamic duo offensively. Um, with that being said, though, I completely underrated Michigan State, which that was a noob move on my part. You know, Tom Izzo having a coach of his caliber with his experience, um, it you can't just bet against that. That was a mistake on my part. They're playing fantastic basketball. That's going to be a fun game. I don't know a whole ton about Michigan State, but they've won their first two games, and they, they had a close game, but they felt in control in both games. So um, I just think that's a pretty even matchup.
I'll put it this way. It's March, and Tom Izzo's Michigan State team, albeit probably this is definitely not the most talented team, not even close to the most talented team he's brought to the Sweet 16 in his career at Michigan State. But they're peaking at the right time. It seems like they get in the tournament and they just find a way to win. And Izzo's his knowledge of the game offensively just makes this team go in that they play a disciplined physical style of defense, just sort of like Tennessee does, but to a lesser extent. Which is why I think that even though it might be an ugly game, I think that like watching Michigan State versus Tennessee in the regional final would just be it'd almost be like watching rugby or football in a way. But that would be just a dogfight, if you want to put it that way. But I do think that this game really comes down to this. K-State is a team with a lot of athleticism and a lot of speed. Marquise Noel is the quickest player left in this tournament, right? He's a smaller guard, attacks slower-footed bigs, which is sort of what Michigan State has. They're not very versatile in what they do defensively. They're very limited to what they do, but they're very good at what they do. So it's going to be hard for, it's not going to be easy for K-State to score in the half court. But if those Michigan State bigs struggle to stay in front of Marquise Noel and even Keontae Johnson in those pick and rolls, it's going to be trouble because you saw what they did in that game against Kentucky. They just continued to run that screen and roll with Marquise Noel. And they couldn't stop it because of how quick he is. He'd get into the lane, shoot the floater. He'd get to the rim and get underneath guys and finish with layups. And then he'd shoot over the top and hit the dagger threes as well. I think his quickness and Keontae Johnson's girth and athleticism and his soft touch from beyond the arc, just K-State's ability to run and speed this game up it's going to be a little bit much for Michigan State. And I'm not the one that's going to be that wants to bet against Tom Izzo, but I think there's something special about this Kansas State team. This was a team that's sort of like Marquette in the Big East, was finished to Pitt, was preseason, which really doesn't matter, but they were picked to finish, towards the bottom of the Big 12, and Jerome Tang, who I think should probably win Coach of the Year, has done a fantastic job, and I think they're just going to be a little bit too athletic and quick for Michigan State. Now, Michigan State, they have a veteran backcourt. AJ Hogard and Tyson Walker are fantastic guards. They want to slow this game down, sort of like in a way Virginia does all the time when they get to the tournament, play at their own pace. They want to dictate the pace. And they have Joey Hauser, who's the brother of Sam Hauser, now of the Boston Celtics in the NBA, who I've heard on different podcasts the be compared to Brady Manick. Like, he is the Brady Manick of this year's tournament, and that he's a solid big, limited athletically, but he can step out and knock down those big shots that when you need him to. And he's sort of been like their X factor so far in this tournament, and as was Brady Manick on last year's North Carolina team. And I get that. I'm not sure I can say like that is the most accurate of comparisons, because I think there was something else that Brady Manick brought to that Carolina team that just went totally underrated, but we're not going to talk about that right now. But I just think that K-State, I think they get by Michigan State by like the tip of their tongues, if you will. And then that would be a contrast of styles with K-State matching up against Tennessee. It's tough, but I think I would go with K-State. I just have a feeling about K-State under Jerome Tang. But we're at 52 minutes. Is there anything you want to say about the Midwest? Because I'd really like to focus on the West Regional with Gonzaga and UCLA and Arkansas and UConn. But if there's anything real fast that you wanted to say about the Midwest Regional, as I'm probably going to talk about that on my Longhorn Deep Dive tomorrow, you're more than welcome to.
I'll hold off on talking about Texas. I want you to have the floor open for your Longhorn deep dive. I'll just touch on the Houston game. Number one, what is the health of Marcus Sasser? Groin injuries tend to linger. That's well documented. He wasn't, he was back, but he wasn't, fully. He clearly was not comfortable in that game. His presence, nonetheless, was felt though, and he did make an impact on that game, even though he wasn't quite 100%. Now with a week off, in theory that could mean he's in a much better spot health wise, but all it takes is one play where he tweaks it, and then you're right back to square one. So having him healthy in the game is going to be so important for Houston. And then number two, Miami is just tough and physical. And we said that so many times on this podcast already. I feel like we're kind of beating a dead horse, but that's the theme in college basketball. I think that's what makes it so different from the NBA with, all the pace and space and the skilled shooting all around the court. In college basketball, it's a lot more like, early 2000s ball where, it's about winning the rebounding battle. It's about making your free throws. It's about getting in the paint, getting good shots, getting post touches to your big, stuff like that. And these teams left, it's all like those are their strengths.
Yeah, I think this Miami-Houston game, here's how I'll put it, and then we'll move on. Miami will have a chance if their two guards, Nigel Pack, who's a smaller but quicker guard, and then Isaiah Wong, who's really their star and their leader, but they're both veteran guards. How they handle Houston's pressure on ball screens and their ability to pass out of those ball screens and make effective decisions and not be forced into turnovers, because Houston under Kelvin Sampson, they've always been a defense that's based on disruption. They want to attack specific areas of your offense based on where they see your weaknesses, and they want to throw off your timing and your rhythm offensively. And what they've done a lot of so far in this tournament is they've hedged hard on ball screens, and they force guards back and force them to make quick decisions in rotation, which has caused thrown teams off rhythm and caused many turnovers, which is sort of how they ended up winning the Auburn game. Auburn really controlled the first half, but then things got sloppy, and Houston's defense, particularly on ball screens, got forced turnovers, and Houston was off and running, and that was that. But I think if any team that Houston has seen so far has the ability to handle that pressure, it is Isaiah Wong and Nigel Pack. And look, with Norchad Omier, his health on the interior has been huge for this Miami team. Even though he's a little bit smaller, I do believe he has the size and the strength to match up with a Jarris Walker on the interior and get those offensive rebounds, get Miami second possessions. So I think this is going to be one of the more competitive games that we have this weekend. It's going to come right down to the wire, and I'd give Miami a solid shot to win, because I believe Jim Larinaga has that team believing. They were in the Elite Eight last year with a lot of these same players, and they brought a lot of those players back. And there's the Marcus Sasser situation, but this Houston team just hasn't looked sharp
Right.
up until this point in the NCAA tournament. And now you're getting to the point where you're starting to play like national championship level caliber competition. Like the teams that are left are, for the most part, you would say like the real deal. Like they've earned their spot in the Sweet 16, and they're really good basketball teams on a college level. So I think Isaiah Wong and Nigel Pack can get the job done. It's just whether or not they end up doing it. Because even though Houston has not played good basketball or a good brand of basketball so far this tournament, this is what Houston does. They just have the ability to win consistently despite not always playing their best. And that's what the great teams do. And that's why Houston's like 30-3 or something like that. So
Right.
I think this will be a fascinating game. Now let's wrap up with the West. We have Arkansas and UConn and Gonzaga UCLA. And if you don't remember, Gonzaga UCLA, this is a rematch of the Final Four matchup 2 years ago. That crazy game where Jalen Suggs hits the buzzer beater and everyone went crazy. So there is some history between these two teams, Gonzaga and UCLA. And I actually have Gonzaga in my original bracket getting to the Final Four. But just your thoughts on, I think Arkansas UConn is probably the most fascinating matchup of the Sweet 16 draw. And then I think Gonzaga UCLA, just based on the history, will also be a fantastic watch. And both these games will be in Las Vegas. So just your quick take on both these games and who you still see coming out of the region and whether or not your pick has changed.
Well, I came into the tournament high on UConn, and high on UCLA as well, and that ended up being correct. The where I missed though was with obviously Kansas, and for the most part, I got this region right. Arkansas, I think, with how they defend and how athletic they are, I'll give them a real shot. But I just think UConn is the better team here. I think they kind of had the upper hand in, just offensive efficiency. Arkansas really struggles with, you know, relying on that 3-point shot a little bit too much, in my opinion. They take a lot of them. Um, and when they're playing their best, they make a lot of them, but it's just not consistent enough, in my opinion. And I think UConn with their defense can really stifle that.
Yeah, UConn presents a much different challenge than Arkansas faced in their round of 32 matchup with Kansas. And the reason for that is because Kansas was a team that, as opposed to previous seasons, they were a lot smaller this year with KJ Adams starting at the 5. He's, 6'7", 6'8". He's a smaller center. And so Kansas went small, and Arkansas being the lengthy athletic team that they are, with their point guard, I believe, Anthony Black being the same height as Kansas's center, KJ Adams Jr., they were able to get on the offensive glass, grab rebounds, 40.5% of their own misses. They shot 60% in the paint. They were just bigger and more athletic than Kansas. And they were able to eventually wear Kansas down on the defensive end with some of the guys that they have. And Eric Musselman, as we know, is probably a top 3, top 4 coach left in this tournament. So you don't want to overlook Arkansas. They're certainly a really, really good team. They're playing really good basketball, but they do at sometimes are over reliant on the 3-point shot. They shoot a lot of them, and they're not always the most efficient shots, and they don't always hit a good percentage of them. And so I think if you're UConn, you present a different challenge because you have the 7-footer Adama Sanogo, and you have your 7'2" freshman Donovan Klinging on the interior, who they can block shots. They're physical. They're hard to stop in the post. And Jordan Hawkins at 6'5", the point guard, is a player that we overlooked coming into this tournament, but he's like an energy bunny, but he's really, really good. I think he'll be an NBA prospect by the end of this tournament. NBA teams are going to love him because he is just quick, he's athletic, and he just wants the ball all the time, and he can do a variety of different things offensively. I just think UConn, with their wings, Andre Jackson and Jordan Hawkins, being able to match up with Arkansas's size and athleticism, and then having those big guys with versatility, the ability to rim protect, is what's going to separate UConn in this game. I have them advancing in a really good game. And in Gonzaga UCLA, the key to me is going to be how UCLA will guard Drew Timme. Because if you look at the history between these two teams, Mick Cronin has really struggled to figure out how to guard Drew Timme. And I get it. You can make the argument that the Gonzaga teams of the past had more ways to hurt you offensively, and I would tend to agree with you. You had the Jalen Suggses of the world. The list goes on, right? But I still think that Drew Timme, as we've seen, coming off a performance where he put up 28 and 8 and was hard to stop in the post and basically willed Gonzaga to victory over who was it that they faced? TCU. In one of the better games of the second weekend, in my opinion. He's really had his way with UCLA in their past 2 matchups. In their last Final Four game, he put up 25 and basically was doing whatever he wanted at any particular time. And Gonzaga ended up winning that game on, of course, the Jalen Suggs buzzer beater, which was incredible. But if you're Mick Cronin, you have to find a way because you're going without, Jalen Clark, who's your best defender. And you've done fine to this point and give them credit for that. And you still have Jaime Jaquez and Tiger Campbell to take care of things offensively for you. But with Adam Bona, your center, being a little bit banged up and not 100%, and then with Drew Timmy's ability now to sort of step out and shoot the three and take you off the dribble, and his control in the post, his bodily control in the post to be able to draw fouls. If Adam Bona gets in foul trouble, it could really cause some troubles for UCLA defensively, because in the past, UCLA has brought double teams to guard Timmy, but Timmy's a very underrated passer, and so he'll just pass out of those double teams. And Gonzaga, with the three-point shooters that they have with Rasir Bolton and Julian Strother, they will kill you if you overcommit on double teams and Drew Timmy passes out of those double teams and they end up hitting threes. And at that point, you're in real trouble because if those Gonzaga guards get hot, well, now you're in a shootout with Gonzaga, and that's exactly what they want you to do. They want to play fast. They want to get up and down. I think for UCLA, the goal is to slow the game a little bit, play your defense, find a way to slow Drew Timmy. I don't know what that is. I'm not a basketball coach, but do what you can, and then let Tiger Campbell and Jaime Jaquez match up with Julian Strother and Rasir Bolton and limit them, out on the perimeter. So I don't know. This game could go either way. I think it all comes down to how UCLA's ability to neutralize or at least make it tough on Drew Timmy and their ability to control the pace. And I know we say that a lot, but it really is true because if this game is up and down, that's the game that Gonzaga wants you to play. And so I just not even Mike Miles and TCU could really keep up at that point. So I'm going to err on the side of saying that UCLA wins this game, but I'm not sure. I could see a scenario where Gonzaga wins. I think a lot of people are still, because Gonzaga is not the undefeated, number one seed, or like they have them the past couple of years. They lost to Loyola Marymount in the regular season. They're a 3 seed. People have seen them, I don't know. I think they're not being appreciated for what they are. So, but Gonzaga UCLA, based on the history of this matchup, who really knows?
Yeah, and you mentioned Drew Timmy. I think the answer of how do you stop Drew Timmy, I think the answer is you don't. I think this might be a risky way. This might be death by 1,000 cuts, but I think you go single coverage on Drew Timmy, and you focus on limiting those shooters on the outside. I think UCLA centers this time around are good enough to make Drew Timmy work for those buckets a little bit more than they have in the past. And, as you said, foul trouble is going to play a big part as well. Foul trouble is going to be huge. So defending without fouling is going to be imperative. But I think on top of that, UCLA their overall team defense is better than it has been in years past. I think they fly around the floor. They're more versatile. They can rotate quicker. They're more on top of their rotations as well. So UCLA, I think their defense is going to be the big question. Their defense has been great all year. Does it stay on that? Is it maintain that level of defense against a great offensive team like Gonzaga? And then for UCLA offensively, I mentioned this in our bracket show. Their shot diet is what concerns me a little bit. They take a lot of mid-range jumpers. They don't get to the rim a whole ton, and they don't take a ton of threes. So, in terms of it just being a math equation, it goes to Gonzaga because 3-point differential in this day and age, it matters a lot, and the mid-range shot, it's not like unimportant. It still has value, absolutely. But when you rely on it too much and you don't take those 3-pointers and the other team is making them, then you're at a complete disadvantage. And it makes it a lot harder to win games. So I think if I'm Gonzaga, I lean into my ability to hit those 3-point shots. Um, I think the inside out game is going to be what wins this game for Gonzaga. And I think that's going to be what gives them the edge. I'm going to pick Gonzaga to win the game. I picked UCLA in my bracket, but I'm going to switch over to Gonzaga.
Okay, so to end the episode, we sort of covered most of what we need to cover for tonight. My new Final Four, and I'm not really gonna tell you who I actually am picking in the Midwest, but for now I'm gonna stick with Houston because they were my national championship pick in um, the our bracket episode before the tournament started, and I still believe that under Kelvin Sampson, having been there, done that, and proving that they can win when they're playing at a subpar level in terms of their standard in that program, uh, with Marcus Sasser still being at the very least a decoy, and with Jarris Walker's tenacity to get on the offensive glass, an area where you look at the the teams that they could potentially face in the regional final, Texas and Xavier, they're not necessarily the greatest in that area. So I know Dylan D'Souza has been fantastic, but that has been more from an offensive standpoint, more so than a defensive rebounding standpoint. And so I think, I don't know, that's just my perspective on it. I'll talk more about Texas tomorrow and who maybe my actual pick is. But I do think I'll stick with Houston. I'm going to go with UConn to come out of the West, even though it's a really tough region. I just watched them, and I think that, um, not starting a player that's shorter than 6'5", and their athleticism and having those two bigs is just, I think Sanogo is one of the better bigs that we have right now in college basketball. And then that freshman is unbelievable. So I think that Hawkins will will that team to the Final Four. I'm going to go with K-State, and then I'm going to go with Alabama. What are you going with?
I'm going to go with Alabama, Tennessee, Texas, and UConn.
Okay, I like it. I like it. So that I believe is going to wrap it up for this Patreon podcast. Thank you so much. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Any parting shots before we sign off?
No, that's it. I really enjoyed this one. I kind of procrastinated a little bit in terms of prep, but I think it still turned out really well on my side of things. Your preparedness was really impressive as well, I thought. And yeah, that's it.
I was a little bit more scrambled I thought I was going to be more like structured and compact with my thoughts on the Sweet 16, but it's okay. This is a Patreon podcast, so it's not meant to be like as what's the word, formal as our traditional episodes, although those have gotten less and less like structured and formal over the years. But I think we've made considerable strides in both areas, Patreon and our normal podcasts in the past year or so, with just the way that we do content and so forth. So We'll continue to do that
Right.
for you guys, but I guess just like my ability to not bet against Tom Izzo coming into the tournament, I don't even know if this makes any sense. We are going, gone.
It probably doesn't, but
Whatever.
we'll go with it. Just like Mike Trout's out batting the bottom ninth. We're gone. See ya.